All right, thank you for your patience and welcome again to Business with the UK in the light of Biden, Boris, and Brexit. We really appreciate your time today. My name is Paul Sennott. I am a co-founding partner of Sennott Williams and Rogers here in Boston, Massachusetts. I head up our copyright and trademark teams. I also work in media and entertainment and transactional spaces. Firm-wide, in addition to our media and entertainment and IP practices, we have a corporate group that handles transactions both in the media and entertainment world and outside. Generally speaking, our business is based on clients that have ideas or intellectual property, and we help them monetize those ideas, protect them, license them, enforce them, all of that good stuff. With me today, I am pleased to have two attorneys from Harrison Clark Rickerbees. Nicolas Groffman is the head of international at HRC, and Robert Rice, partner in the corporate group at HCR. We're going to sort of structure this. I'm going to toss out questions to them and they will answer, but I would encourage all of you, if you have questions that come up as we're talking, to type them right in the Q&A box. I'll keep an eye on those and toss those out as they come in. We would welcome your participation in that regard. We are, of course, broadcasting remotely, as we have been doing now for nearly a year. I'm sure you all can sympathize. So I apologize in advance if we have any sound problems, technical difficulties, etc. So without any further ado, let's get started. Robert, Nicolas, how are you today?
Very good, thanks, Paul.
Good, thanks. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for that intro.
Taking part.
Glad to hear that. Thank you for your time. So I'm going to go through, I had put together some questions. I had some thoughts and I'll also, as I said, toss out some questions from the Q&A as they come in. But first for you, Nicolas, how does Brexit affect just generally US companies dealing with the EU?
Right. Well, thanks for that one. I think for US companies that are selling direct into Europe, Brexit probably makes no difference, right? I mean, they're just carrying on doing what they were doing. But of course, a lot of US companies have established themselves in the UK for the purposes of treating the UK as their hub for the region. And for those guys, there's some work that they're going to need to do if they've been using Britain as a launch pad for European sales. Now, it's still worth them doing that for various reasons that might go beyond the scope of that question. But basically, all goods going from the UK to Europe are in theory zero tariffed. So because of the trade and cooperation agreement that the UK and the EU have finally negotiated after a lot of work, that means that goods going in won't be treated just as any old third-party country with potential high tariffs. So it's still better for them to do that than it is to go direct from the US. The problem, and I think the things that US companies are going to have to get to grips with, is the added layer of bureaucracy, which we have been learning very quickly is more than just, oh, I'm going to have to tick an extra box. There's a lot of work to be done to prove, for example, to satisfy rules of origin requirements. And that administrative difficulty turns into a real cost, because if you haven't done it right, and a lot of British companies, especially the SMEs, didn't get it right, their goods are just held up and can't even get into Europe. Then it depends which port you're going in at. So if you're going in at Dublin, as opposed to Zeebrugge, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, or Calais, then you've got a bit more difficulty. So yeah, it will affect US companies. Some might even think of setting up an extra subsidiary in the EU as a result.
And for companies that have not yet set up on what I'll call the other side of the Atlantic, your side of the Atlantic, would it make more sense for them to set up in an EU country rather than the UK? And if so, which EU country seems most inviting?
Yeah, I'd say if they were going to do that, that should be in addition to a UK subsidiary. But that's just, you can't really give an answer across the board for that one, because every business has its own particular markets.
Mhm.
So first off, you can't really treat the EU as one market. Each country has its own, from a commercial point of view, has its own particular demands and desires with regard to US products or services. So that's one thing. But the other is, if a lot of US clients have gone, oh, I don't care about Brexit, because they want to be in the UK for other reasons that are nothing to do with the relationship with the EU, and that's language, the fact that the law is similar or more similar than continental Europe, and there's other things. But to answer the second part of your question, which was about which of the EU countries is the best one, leaving aside the bit about which market does your business care about, then you're looking at efficiency. So we've found that generally the likes of the Netherlands and the Nordic countries are a lot more efficient to deal with. They can set up companies quicker. The way that their administration works is closer to the UK, the US, and the Anglo countries. And once you get down to Spain, France, Italy, which are larger markets, but just that bit more difficult for American, and this is just a generalization. Obviously, some US people have very close ties with those Mediterranean countries, but generally they find it more difficult, and bureaucracy can be a bit slower. And I'm being a bit unkind to those countries. In certain industry sectors, they can be world beating. So that's a generalization.
Sure, understood. Thank you. For you, Rob, what's your sense of the market in the UK for transactions in now, and what does the rest of 2021 look like?
Thank you, Paul. I would say, in short, very, very busy, very active. Although obviously we've all been battling with the dreaded pandemic, and reading various reports, you can read about doom and gloom. I think, I saw something that said our economy shrank by 20%, which was the largest fall in peacetime, in the peacetime era. Notwithstanding that, we've actually started to recover quite quickly. And I think, as one of our managing partners says, that in times of challenge, there always comes opportunity. And so for all sorts of reasons, we're seeing a lot of M&A activity. We've got businesses looking to divest underperforming or non-core assets. We've got private equity businesses looking to invest in new platforms, particularly around technology, where there's been a move into digital. So there's lots and lots of activity going on. I think also we've always had a consumer-led economy here. So there is a big wall of cash that people like ourselves have built up because we've been stuck at home and not traveling and doing things like that. So there's, I think, some estimates of about 175 billion of saved cash that individual consumers are sitting on at the moment here in the UK, and that at some point will start to be deployed and to drive the economy forwards as we get eased out of lockdown, which happily is now looking like it's starting to happen. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect as well, I think, related to that, that's worth mentioning is that as far as investors are concerned, similar story. There's, I think, over in the States at the moment, by some estimates, there's around $7.6 trillion of cash that corporations and investors are sitting on that can be deployed. So I think that, along with the fact that there's plenty of movement within the market, will mean that we're likely to see a lot of activity. And certainly this last 12 months for us, I mean, almost embarrassingly, from a transactional point of view, has been our busiest ever 12 months. And actually, we've been measured by Experian in the last 12 months as being the third most active advisors in the UK by volume of deals transacted. So it gives you a sense of what we're seeing. And I just don't see any slowdown over the next 12 months. Very optimistic for it.
Oh, great, great. Um, and what are there any particular sectors that seem to be, particularly active or particularly driving that movement? And do you expect those same sectors to be active this year, or do you expect a shift as sort of different entities take steps to prepare for the rebound?
Yeah, I think what we've noticed is that I guess there's been a lot of activity in the healthcare sector. I mean, traditionally, healthcare has been seen as a relatively safe sector for investors. So, it will have fared well in challenging times anyway. But obviously, the fact that we've had the COVID pandemic and a lot of interest in certain businesses within healthcare has helped the market in that sense, and we've seen a lot of sort of trickle down from the bigger deals that have been done at the lower end of the market. So we're certainly anticipating that in the next 12 to 18 months that that will still continue to be very active, and the valuations will be quite high. We're also seeing we have a particular specialism within the UK for advising aggregators of veterinary, dentistry and general health practices. And again, we've seen an awful lot of consolidation with the aggregators coming in and buying up large numbers of practices across towns and so on in the UK. We anticipate that will continue, and that's been one of the factors that's certainly helped our rankings in terms of the deals that we've been doing. The other sort of obvious sector that we've seen being very busy has been retail. You've probably read over there that there's been a few sort of high profile casualties of the pandemic. I think that the jury's out on whether it's the pandemic alone that has caused some of the collapses. I think a lot of them will, if we're being honest about it, they've failed to keep up with digital transformation, and they haven't moved their businesses online as quickly or as successfully as they might have done, and certainly as some of their competitors have done. So there's been a mad scramble for some of the brands of those businesses that have some goodwill utility left in them. That those brands are being acquired and people are moving the brands online. So that's been quite an interesting feature of the market. And what we're seeing off the back of that is quite a lot of activity around the sector and the businesses that support those online businesses. So, for instance, developers of online e-commerce platforms and that sort of thing. There's a fair amount of activity and interest coming in from investors to acquire those sorts of businesses and perhaps use them as platforms themselves. And I think the other one that we've seen a lot of activity in, and I think that will continue given the current mood, is environmental. We've been doing quite a lot of work on transactions for relatively innovative environmental businesses and recyclers and those sorts of businesses, because I think there's a lot more interest in sort of ESG and both within the business-to-business market, but also driven by investors. So I'm going to expect that to continue. And again, from our government's perspective, Boris has been saying for some time that one of the things that they're going to be trying to achieve over here is a recovery out of the pandemic that's sort of led by the green sector. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of money going into that.
Well, that's really interesting to hear. And as a sort of a segue, I suppose, into some of the changes we're seeing in the U.S. and the change of administration. And there's certainly a general expectation that environmental issues will become more front and center than they have been for the last 4 years. Yeah. But I'm not hearing necessarily the same focus as Boris seems to be applying to that. So that's interesting to hear. And certainly I'm seeing similar similar transactions in my trademark business about those sort of older brands that maybe still have some cachet, but the business fell out because they didn't transfer online or something like that. And those trademarks and those brands, that brand awareness can still have value. And that's certainly an important asset of expiring businesses, provided they've managed to maintain the brands. It can be a little tough to maintain a trademark when you haven't used it for a while. So that's something we've been helping a lot of people strategize on and fight over, candidly. Because, you know, why buy a trademark if it's been abandoned and you can just take it? But that would be for a trademark specific webinar. I won't go too much further into that. Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. Nicolas, back to you. You know, we were talking about the new administration in DC and their priorities. What is the UK's, or your sense of the Biden administration's thoughts on the UK? Is it a priority for them? Is it not a priority for them? And if it's not, how do you think the UK can get their attention?
Yeah, well, thanks. But that's a polite way of putting it, isn't it? Because we all know that the UK is not going to be at the top of the list of things that the new administration in DC has to worry about, right? I mean, there's enough going on at home. There are enough there's China, you know, there's plenty of other things away from home as well. So the UK, you know, is not necessarily top of the list. But first of all, I think US-UK business is extraordinarily resilient. And the great thing about the free countries, right? I mean, they don't depend on the goodwill of the White House or any other political or governmental unit to crack on with their business. And so whether it's Trump or Obama, or it doesn't matter who, you know, both the trade and the mutual investment relationship just keeps going. And it's incredibly strong. And if you just look at trade, you know, the UK-US relationship is around about number 7 for the US. We're not at the top of the pile. But in terms of UK business, the US is top. There's no country that comes close to the amount of business we do with the US. No European country. You know, the EU likes to say that it's one entity, but it clearly isn't. And so that's why the US is top for us. But in terms of mutual investment, they're both top. The US invests more and has more stock of investment capital in the UK than anywhere else. That includes its massive trading partners. That includes the likes of Canada and so on. It's just amazing. But of course, the trade with Canada is greater. But having said all that, I hope that we do end up with more incentives. And I think that it's kind of up to the UK to do that. It's the UK that wants the free trade agreement with the United States. I think the United States would like a free trade agreement with us, but again, it's not top of the list. So it's kind of up to us to say, hey, this is a brilliant idea. If we did that, it would enable trade between the US and the UK with fewer legal and regulatory hurdles. We could have lower tariffs. It's incredible how high the trade is between the countries, despite the fact that we have relatively high tariffs. That we are trading more with the US than we are with Germany, where we had no tariffs historically until and even now. And you know, getting a free trade agreement, that all seemed so close last year. It was a combination of COVID-19 and also the Democrats getting angry with the UK and the way that we were handling the Irish border. That made everything a bit harder. And President Biden, rightly, is kind of saying to the UK, well, get in line with this. The US was the sponsor of the agreement between Ireland and the UK on Northern Ireland. But that's been sorted out. Yeah. So now we've still got trouble on the Irish border, but this time it's clearly the fault of the EU and not the UK. The EU is getting blamed for difficulties, and the EU amazingly has been criticized by the Irish. So that kind of moves that particular hurdle out of the way. Another point is, I think Joe Biden and Boris personally, before he came into office, there was always that question about, is Boris a bit too friendly with Trump? Yeah. He looks like Trump. He's got blonde hair. We don't like him. And then we've sort of moved on from that very quickly, because Mr. Biden, he's inherited government departments that are stuffed with hundreds of these really powerful officials. We call them civil servants, who are used to working with their counterparts in Britain. They work intensively with the Foreign Office, our Department of International Trade, the Ministry of Defense, and then you've got all these spooks, the GCHQ working with the NSA, our MI6 working with their equivalents over there. So that there's a real brotherhood or sisterhood of civil servants, and they're used to working together to help get things done, and that's all around the world. And those relationships, they exist now. They have existed for decades, and we've going back to the wars, obviously shed blood together, but independently of the current administration, these relationships carry on. And then there's just a language and a culture and a habit of working together that's going to help and inform Mr. Biden. And then there's the hard truth that the UK, in fact, was not this Trump-loving nation. And as I think his administration, I mean, talking about his politicos as opposed to the civil servants, are realizing that, hey, actually, these Brits didn't really like Trump that much anyway. But Boris was kind of towing the line because he had to. And it was Trump himself going on about how he loves the UK. So that sort of implied to the Democrats that, oh, well, if he's saying that, then the UK must love him. It was never true. And I think his team are discovering that in due course as they are able to lift themselves out of the local issues that they're concerning themselves about. Also, Britain was clearly delighted when Biden won, at least most. It was an enormously high approval rating, higher than in the US. So that should be a welcome surprise to the Democrats, and I think that will help lay the foundation of a closer relationship.
Gotcha. And are you
on that point?
That was thoughtful and appreciated. Points well taken. Are you seeing an increased willingness, or are you expecting an increased willingness for U.S. companies to trade with the UK now that the EU is less accessible? Is that going to? Do you see that shift happening?
Well, that's interesting. It's more, I suppose, for the UK to think, oh, well, the EU is less accessible, so let's reach out more to the US than we have been. And that, I reckon that there is something in that, because a lot of our clients, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, the guys with, below 50 million cap, those guys, typically they've not even, some of them have never exported, even though they're dealing with the EU all the time. That sounds weird, but what it means is that trade between the UK and the EU was not an import-export trade. It was just trade, because there were no borders, right? And now that's suddenly gone away. And some of them are still trying desperately to just keep their old model of business going. And those guys, if you ask me, are going to be sunk, because you can't. And they've had 4 years to get to grips with this. The more flexible British companies have realized, I'm going to be exporting if I deal with the EU. So I might as well look at those other markets that have effectively ignored. And, they've done that because business people in their day-to-day lives, they're focused on their product, right? Or their service. And they should be. They shouldn't be thinking, where's the next tax dodge, or what's my global strategy? People just don't have time to think that. And kind of in the last few years, they've had no choice. They've had to think, oh my God, Brexit is happening. I need to recalibrate. I need to look at other markets. So in that sense, they're looking to US, China, India, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, everywhere. And then I'd say that after the EU, the US is definitely the next choice, because that's the one that everyone's familiar with culturally. Everyone speaks English. The countries are closer than they probably think. And so there is that increased willingness. But in the other direction, maybe less so. I don't see why. If I were American, I wouldn't think, oh, Britain's just come out of the EU, I better trade with those guys more. It's again us trying to confirm all the advantages, and there are some. This hasn't yet come to the US, but this was something that fascinated me when I observed it at an Anglo-Danish thing I was involved in. That was the Confederation of Danish Industry, and they were encouraging Danish companies to set up in the UK. Even after Brexit. And this was because the UK has just negotiated a free trade agreement with Japan, which is different to the one that the EU's got. So that's another, most of us don't like Brexit, but people like me who are optimistic are going, yeah, we're going to have all these new free trade agreements. That's nice. And you look at the Japan one, and that is so tailored to British and Japanese needs. The EU-Japan one was not. It was like a compromise across the entire bloc.
Yeah.
And so Denmark's economy, which is much more tech-focused, e-commerce, digital, was able to benefit from the UK-Japan treaty if they set up a subsidiary there. And I'm sure that little tidbits like this will filter out to the United States as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Robert. Turning the microphone back to you, and thinking about more investor thoughts and investor perspectives. How has the regulatory landscape changed for investors since Boris was elected or re-elected at this point?
Happily, thus far, not to any significant extent. I think probably it's safe to say that as far as investors are concerned, the re-election of Boris, particularly with the strong majority that he needed ahead of the last Brexit wranglings, would have been cause for a huge sigh of relief for investors from an economic point of view, I would think, because I think certainly on this side of the water, I think there was some real fear that if Labour got into power and took over, then we would start to see that there would be a squeeze on businesses to support the economy, and we'd have seen things like corporation tax rates rising and possibly increased levels of bureaucracy. And obviously that's not happened. The Conservative government, I think, has largely been seen to be more supportive of enterprise and business generally. So that's a good thing. And I think, it certainly helped to maintain the levels of activity that we've seen. In terms of regulation and what we're likely to see directly as a result of the election, I think the most significant thing to flag is that we've got legislation coming our way, not yet enacted. We're not entirely sure when it will be enacted, but I suspect it won't be that long. But it will be broadly reflective of some of the legislation we see in some of the EU member states, and also I think similar to legislation that you have over there in the US, which is designed to protect assets within particularly sensitive industries, defense, intelligence, security, anything related to that. I think for us, we've had a relatively benign attitude towards investment coming in and investors starting to look at our assets that are operating in that sector. We had a regime that enabled our Competition and Markets Authority to look at transactions if they triggered particular turnover levels, but it wasn't sort of sector specific. And in fact, Nicolas and I were involved in a transaction. It's quite few and far, or quite rare that you see this sort of thing happening in the UK, but we were involved in a transaction a couple of years ago that was stopped. The first we heard of it was when our Trade and Industry Secretary stood up on a Friday night in the Houses of Parliament and put a block on it because it had triggered one of these turnover thresholds and it was within a sensitive sector. Now, I think with the new legislation that's going to come in, depending on which sectors investors are looking at, if they fall within any of the sensitive sectors, such as artificial intelligence, energy, defense, civil nuclear stuff. I mean, there's very, very broad headings at the moment. We're going to have a regime that will involve possibly voluntary notification to the government to say that there is a possible transaction being made. The threat, in inverted commas, of the government being able to call in and investigate transactions that do take place within those sectors and to be able to call them in and review them for quite a long period of time after they've been done. some of which sounds quite punitive, but I think it is just bringing us into line with some of the other economies out there. So I think in terms, just to circle back, in terms of new legislation coming in, that's really the only thing to watch for investors that are coming over. And what it will mean is that there'll have to be a lot more careful thought ahead of getting into a transaction as to how this legislation will impact on deal timetables, because it's actually going to make things quite difficult if you consider a transaction within a sensitive, rapidly evolving area, that you've suddenly got to factor in the possibility of notifying that transaction to somebody and then waiting while the government reviews it. And it will be a relatively new team of people, although they've been assembled and they're ready to go. It'll be a relatively new team of people that are looking at these transactions and trying to decide whether or not the government does want to step in or impose conditions on them. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But happily, I think as far as everything else goes, there's, the government will be very keen to make sure that we're not seen as being overly bureaucratic, and that we're seen as an attractive place to invest from an economic standpoint.
Okay, and so that certainly seems like one potential pitfall to keep an eye out for. Are there any other longstanding or even new pitfalls for investors to consider when deciding whether to acquire stock or assets?
So I think the obvious one, if you're trying to establish, there's going to always be tax drivers that'll tilt towards a particular way of structuring a transaction, and the obvious risks that come with acquiring stock is that you run the risk of picking up liabilities that are inherent in the target that you acquire. So you've always got to look at those and make sure that the split of risk for those liabilities has been properly assessed. I think the one thing that I would flag that over the years, it's become apparent to me that isn't necessarily widely known outside of our jurisdiction is that if investors are looking at acquiring assets as opposed to stock, then we have a piece of legislation over here that we call TUPE, which is designed to protect employees. And certainly I've found in my experience, people find this quite a strange concept at times, but the idea behind TUPE is that if you acquire a business or a package of assets together that can be described as a business, the effect of TUPE is to transfer automatically all of the contracts of employment of the people engaged in that business over to the acquirer. So, suddenly the acquirer can be picking up a heap of liabilities, potentially that they might not have bargained for at the outset. The other thing about it is it brings into play some quite detailed obligations as regards consulting with the employees that are affected or informing them that there's going to be a transaction. So, and I'm involved in one at the moment where, if you can imagine you're the owner of a business and looking to sell, you don't really necessarily want to put your head above the parapet and tell your employees that you're thinking of selling your business and, hey, let's all sit down and talk about it. It can be a bit of an issue sometimes. And I did have a client in Boston a couple of years ago that were coming over to make their first acquisition in the UK. We were talking to them because it was a relatively small deal. They wanted to structure it as an assets deal and pick out what they wanted and not spend a lot of time worrying about it. But actually, once we'd started to talk about TUPE and everything that came with it, it made more sense in that case to actually acquire the business as a whole, the stock, and not go through this rather disruptive consultation process. So it can be quite interesting. So yeah, I think that's the sort of oddball piece of legislation, rather, I'd say, that in my years I've come across that people aren't necessarily aware of.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine that being a foreign concept to to entities in the U.S. just based on our sort of lack of regulation in that regard.
Yeah.
A question from the floor, which Nicolas, I'll let you start with, although Robert, jump in. In the U.S., we are in an age of hyper-partisan pendulum swings, obviously, and that has. We've seen it result in downstream dissolution or reduced confidence in long-standing agreements and accords. The U.S. pulled out of Paris. The U.S.'s participation in NAFTA was drastically changed under Trump. And there seems like there's going to be a swing back. With the UK leaving the EU, it would, it seems that insulating from that sort of volatility is potentially even more of a priority now. How do you think the UK might approach this?
Wow, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, because there are several concepts in there. And I think, that's almost a globalist view, isn't it? That there's this reduced trust in long-standing world institutions, and that reduced trust, which can partly be blamed on the US for those organizations that it left, and partly blamed on the UK for leaving the EU. And I suppose that could undermine confidence, not just in those countries, but around the world, because they have global repercussions. And it could lead to instability or even harm. So, I mean, that all makes sense. I would say that with regard to the US, though, from my point of view, I wouldn't see it as a pendulum, because a pendulum implies that, oh my God, 1 minute the US is extremely right over here, now it's extreme over there. We would see it more in terms of US participation in global affairs as just steady, 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 steady. Trump, whoa, crazy, and then steady, steady again. That's what it looks like to me. And I think a lot of people in the UK and the EU would also see it that way. We wouldn't see it as a swinging back and forth of craziness. Now, it's all very well for me to say that. I wasn't in Washington, D.C. when the Capitol was stormed. Even with that, though, I think there's a general feeling outside the US that that wasn't the disaster that you guys might think it was. To me, I came away from that thinking, wow, lots of countries have insurrections, they have coups, they have people invading parliaments, and it sets them back. There's gunfire, there's large numbers of deaths. The institutions don't come out of it unscathed. Somebody declares a new regime, somebody declares a military junta, there's a change of government. With the US, everything just carried on. The institutions in the US are so incredibly strong that they just withheld that and shrugged it off almost. And the judges and the politicians and everyone just carried on. There was a lot of talk, and regrettably there were deaths, but nothing on the scale that you have in even neighboring countries. So, the US has such high standards and expectations of itself that I think you can exaggerate the ramifications of that. And of course, that doesn't stop foreign countries. China was gloating about it. Russia was gloating about it, saying, look at these crazy Americans. But no one takes that seriously because it's coming from propaganda units rather than news units. So that's my comment on that bit. With what can the UK do? How might the UK approach this? Well, I'm kind of going to refer back to what I said before. I mean, I agree. The UK is partly to blame for this. We're leaving Brexit, leaving the EU and all our friends and neighbours behind. But we're coming through that. We've already got an arrangement with them. So that we've already done step one of that, which is the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. Painful, but there it is. And it's now up to us to create arrangements with other countries, which we're doing. We haven't even considered pulling out of NATO, for example. And that was something that Trump did that scared people a bit, but the US wasn't ever going to pull out of NATO. They just wanted the Europeans to pay a bit more. So with NATO, which I think is more significant in a way for global security than pretty much any other organization, all that the Trump administration was doing was saying that the Europeans should pay their share. And of course, that really offended them. And they made out that that was part of Trump craziness. I don't think it was. And what should the UK do? Let's negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States. Step one, and with all the other institutional alignment that is in existence between the UK, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, that's a key thing that hasn't even been remotely affected by the other pendulum swings or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I was going to circle back to that idea that you had expressed earlier, which is, these career civil servants on both sides of the Atlantic who've been working together for decades largely haven't changed. They're still there. They were there before. They're there now, and those relationships continue and are somewhat insulated from politics and the changes of administration at the top. And I guess my view is very similar on that while the president may change parties, while different parties may control Congress, to a large extent, the functions of the federal government and the bureaucracy stay fairly consistent because the people there stay fairly consistent. And that was one of the criticisms, I suppose, from Trump and some of his supporters, was that that consistency, or that the deep state wording gets thrown around a lot. But I view it in a similarly positive way, that it provides a lot of that insulation from.
Yeah, but Paul, I think the other interesting thing is we talk freely about this, and I'm I'm talking about what Americans might think, and you can be pretty comfortable doing that, even though clearly I'm not American, and there are plenty of Americans here who know far more about what the United States thinks and feels than I do, and we just make all these assumptions quite happily. Now, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that with a European audience, which I think says something to the relationship that exists between the UK and the US. We're pretty free speaking. We don't get offended. We just argue stuff out. And that's not been the case with Brexit. So with Brexit, people took really, I think, quite extreme positions. And for me, coming back I lived in China most of my professional career, and I came back to the UK just in time for the Brexit debate to start happening. And so I was just casually chatting away about it, not thinking that people's hackles rise. And certainly our European friends who live in the UK, you could not joke about these things. So people had to kind of either not talk about it, or they did the classic millennial thing, which is you go online and you start venting your spleen.
Apologies to any millennials on the call, on the webinar. Thank you.
I think the only thing, just touching on that, Paul, sorry to cut across, just anecdotally, but since Brexit, the thing that struck me is we haven't seen these, horrendous queues of lorries coming over from or looking to get out of the UK and into Europe. There was a lot of scaremongering going on, I think, prior to Brexit, that it was going to cause chaos and that the supply chain just would cease to function. And actually, not a bit of it. I mean, it just seems to me that life has carried on as normal on the ground for people. So, it's very much business as usual, I would say.
Yeah, and on this, the media on this side of the Atlantic, because I think because it's a good story, seemed to be reaching for any evidence of that. And I remember seeing a couple of news stories that I found personally sort of unconvincing, trying to sound the alarm that there was some backup of, I don't know, 20 tons of pork or something, and it didn't seem that bad to me. But I've not been.
That was Rob's ration.
Terribly closely. Was that? Yeah.
Rob's ration of pork.
Well, thank you. And I would encourage our audience to keep sending in questions, and we'll do our best to answer them in the 15 minutes we have left. Going back to some things I had thought about in advance. And this is a very broad question for you primarily, Nicolas, but what advantages do you see the UK being able to offer to a US company that Europe can't offer?
Well, the UK is heaven on earth, as we all know. I'm going to end up repeating myself because I've already said,
sure.
But the legal system being very similar,
Mm-hmm.
or at least more similar than any continental European country.
Mm-hmm.
So Americans tend to be more comfortable with English law than say French or German, Spanish law. Then you get the cultural similarity. The language is incredibly important. The fact that in England we think of ourselves as native speakers of English. You can debate that. Then the cultural similarity, the shared, we all watch the same movies, we listen to the same pop music, right? I mean, these things matter, and that goes beyond any agreements or arrangements. And I think that's borne out by the fact that, we have had this incredible volume of trade between the two countries, even though there are high tariffs between them. And then I'd add to that, the fact that we've been negotiating free trade agreements with other countries that are really, some of them are excellent. I mean, there's conformity of standards and zero tariff for all sorts of products across, and I mentioned the one with Japan. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there, otherwise I'll end up repeating myself even more.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
And I think from my perspective, I would just say that, historically, in terms of investment coming over from the US towards Europe, well, you're looking at something like 35 to 40% of that investment has been steered towards the UK. And for all the reasons that Nicolas has just talked about, frankly, I don't anticipate seeing that really changing. I think that there will always be a significant level of activity between us, and it's best close friend status. That's the way I would see it continuing.
Yeah, and just something made me think. Both of those responses made me think of something that, Nicolas, you've highlighted in the past in our conversations, which is the importance of simple communication to getting business deals done. And one facet of that is, of course, language. Language barriers can be cleared with translation, but what is much harder to clear is, or what makes it easier to clear those hurdles, is having a shared sort of background or shared understanding, shared worldview, shared reference points, even something as simple as you mentioned, Nicolas, pop cultural references and things like that. It's a lot easier to establish rapport, I find, with UK colleagues, just because of that shared background. There's less chance for offense, less chance for unintentional miscommunication. And so that was sort of ringing in my ears as you were giving that answer, Nicolas. So let's see, we're getting towards the end of our time, and I want to sum this up, but let me I guess I just have one more question to follow up on the advantages of the UK. Are you seeing UK markets sidelined as countries like the US, China, India focus on the EU? It sounds like no.
Well, actually, with China, there is, I think, at the moment, more of a focus on the EU. That's not because of Brexit, though. So during the whole Brexit run-up, we got quite positive noises out of China, not at the political top level, which kind of officially was supporting the stay in the EU stuff, and they were doing that again to try and be helpful to the then incumbent British government. Mm-hmm. But afterwards, all the unofficial conversations I had with people in China, or nearly all, were like, well, that's good for us, isn't it? It's going to be a level playing field. And that was certainly the case with immigration. So previously the immigration system of the UK just massively favored anyone from the EU, and pretty much everyone else was given a really miserable time. Mm. And now there's a level playing field. So in a way that benefits non-EU countries. But with China now, they're more friendly with the EU, and that's, I think, for political reasons, in that the EU's agreed to sort of not make quite such a fuss about Xinjiang or Hong Kong. Britain's really annoyed China with its offer of citizenship in the UK mm-hmm. to British nationals overseas who live in Hong Kong, and even people who just have the right to be British nationals overseas. So I think all those sort of political, human rights related reasons have meant that China is sort of slightly turning towards the EU more than it was. But even that is probably over-egged. As for India, the United States, and so on, no, we haven't seen any sidelining of the UK yet. We wait to see how that happens, because if the EU successfully markets itself as being, hey, if you want to deal with the EU, there's no point setting up in Britain. And if that propaganda, which is definitely there, and we've witnessed it with some of our own clients who are distributors based in the UK, and they're being told, oh, well, that's a mistake. So there's a lot of that on both sides. The UK is doing the same thing. We're saying we're really wonderful, but the EU, I think, has definitely tried to incentivize people from other countries to not set up distribution centers in the UK. Other than that, we haven't. So it's only really China that's the odd one out of those countries that you just named, where they're moving a bit towards the EU, and I don't think that'll last, to be honest.
Yeah, and it's following up on that. Is your sense that the EU is less likely to take political positions adverse to Chinese interests that would help facilitate that? I mean, because you mentioned the UK's approach to citizenship, which got reported on widely here and has been a focus.
Yeah, well, we had to do that with Hong Kong because we have treaty. Sure. I mean, we have obligations to Hong Kong as an ex-colony. Mm-hmm. So if we'd not done that, that would have been awful. Boris's government, though, surprised everyone by going beyond what its obligations are and offering that right to people who hadn't even applied for British national overseas status. So you never know where these guys are going to lurch back over to next. Goes to the pendulum point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I think it's a bit unfair to say that the Europeans don't care about human rights abuses in China and all that stuff, because they do. It's perhaps that at a Brussels level, at an EU level, there's a bit more of a tendency to accommodate than there is at national levels in all the European countries, including Britain. And now Britain's by itself, it kind of doesn't have to play that whole game of going along with certain requirements of the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we see that increasingly here in dealing with China. A number of businesses have gotten themselves in hot water, and it's a difficult business decision. I mean, they can either accommodate China in ways that royally piss off many of their US customers, or they cannot in ways that royally piss off China. And that can be a delicate balance. And that's going to be, I think, something that lots of the sort of Western world has to deal with. So it's really helpful to get your perspective on that.
Well, just very quickly on that point, because it's close to my heart. I mean, I think a lot of our attitudes towards China have changed. China hasn't suddenly become a nasty country and got worse than it ever was. And that's a big misconception. I think what's happened is it's become strong and rich. And we were used to dealing with a relatively weak China. And now that it's strong and rich, we hold it to a much, much higher standard. And we can also observe anything we don't like because of mass media, video sharing, and so on, that people suddenly get upset about stuff that would have just been ignored 2 decades ago, or even just a decade ago.
That's a good point. Well, we are wrapping up our time. If there are any more questions from the floor, speak now or forever hold your peace. I'll start summing up, but if I see a quick one come through, we can try to squeeze it in. I am cognizant of everybody's time constraints. I want to thank all of the participants for joining us today. I want to thank Robert and Nicolas for your thoughts and insight, which I hope proved valuable. Certainly proved valuable to me. I hope all of the participants shared that. We're going to send a follow-up email to all of the participants with a link so that you can tell us how we might improve, or tell us what we did well. We like hearing that too, but more importantly, how we might improve. And we're going to follow up in a few days with a recording of this presentation in case you want to share it with colleagues or watch it again. To your heart's content. So again, thank you for the time. Seeing no further questions, I will let all of you go. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.